All right, like we have been reporting, many thanks for staying with us here on KTN News. Let's continue with our discussion. The African Union has told Kenya and Somalia to sort out their issues to make sure that the tension that has been ongoing at the common border in Mandera and Bulahawa does not continue. We have been discussing that. We did start that discussion. We have with us Patrick Maluki, Dr. Patrick Maluki, Diplomacy Scholars Association of Kenya. We also have with us, joining us via the phone, John Gashie, Regional Security Analyst. Let me come back to you, Daktari, before we go to John Gashie. From what you had explained earlier with the politics in Somalia, the Somali people going to the ballot next month, would you say that Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo is a worried man in terms of retaining power? Let's start there.
Thank you. Thank you for getting back to me. Well, every elected leader must be worried because the position he holds, it is courtesy of the electorate, and therefore I'm sure he must be strategizing on how to retain power. And so part of the strategizing would need to purge some of the internal opposition so that he can actually leverage on the local support. In so doing, he is likely to upset other regional powers or regional states, because Somalia has been very volatile for a while, and many countries, including Ethiopia, Kenya, Eritrea, Djibouti, have always been worried about the Somali conflict spilling over to their national borders. And for that reason, they have taken certain measures to insulate themselves from the internal conflict of Somalia. Now, Farmajo has a big task of how to maintain internal peace and harmony, and especially with the regional powers, without antagonizing regional security. And this is where the electoral process becomes actually an international issue of concern, that the neighboring countries of Somalia are worried of who takes power, how that power will be distributed, and the implication of it. Because there has been discussion as to whether the Somali government may need to negotiate with Al-Shabaab factions to see if they can actually bring them on board in the government after the elections. Such a move would really worry a country like Kenya, because Al-Shabaab is a sole enemy to Kenya. And therefore, any effort or move to incorporate Al-Shabaab factions in the forthcoming Somalia government would really be resisted by neighboring countries, even Ethiopia. And so these factors contribute to the kind of tension and uneasiness that is being now experienced in Somalia. So the elections, although they are basically internal affairs, they have international dimensions because they affect the security situation in the neighboring countries. And that has seen the neighbors actually projecting some kind of power or interest on how the elections are conducted. Thank you.
Thank you, Daktari. Let me bring in John Gashie, Regional Security Analyst. John, you were explaining something before we went for a break. Let's pick it up from the politics of Somalia, who go to the polls next month. How much of a role is what we saw yesterday at the common border between the two countries? How much of that has got to do with the inside politics of Somalia? Is Farmajo worried that he may not be getting back to Villa Somalia from where you sit?
It's quite clear that regardless of what is happening right now within or along the Kenyan border, Farmajo's plan and indeed his succession, so to speak, whether he will retain the seat, is a very critical issue at the moment. But perhaps as indicated elsewhere, Somalia's internal political dimensions and the competition has always drawn the interest of the regional powers. And in this regard, one of the regional powers that has a lot of interest is, of course, Ethiopia, and the other bigger interest is within Kenya. Remember that both Kenya and Ethiopia do have, a large Somali, people of Somali origin as, their citizens. And remember that Kenya and Somalia and Ethiopia have had in the past disagreed and had what we would call almost direct confrontation. In Kenya, that is the Shifta War, and with Ethiopia, that was the Ogaden in the 1970s. And remember that again, the clan issue, the clan-based, political, internal political dispensation in Somalia also affects Kenya, one way or the other. Now, we cannot therefore then rule out that what is happening with Farmajo and what is happening internally in Somalia will have a major impact in Kenya, one way or the other, and that Kenya is an interested state. Now, how well then Kenya addresses its basic security, political, trade, and diplomatic engagement with Somalia and also Jubaland will have a direct impact on the future, specifically how well will a new political leadership in Somalia will relate with Kenya, as much as how will that relate with Ethiopia, Djibouti, and even Eritrea. And then there are other international interests at play. In this regard, we have the terror, the piracy, and then, of course, we have the hydrocarbon issue, then we have the border, and then we have the larger interest of countries like Turkey, countries like China, France, the U.S., and, of course, Britain, and then the Red Sea. So Somalia is in a very interesting zone, and whatever happens in Somalia will affect a lot of issues. Then we have the Somaliland issue. And then the issue that Somali government has broken relations with Kenya. So it's a very mucky place, but it's all leading up to this electoral issue.
Tell me this, John.
Yes.
Kenya has been quite measured in dealing with this issue.
Yes.
Mogadishu, not so much. They have severed ties with Nairobi. Moving forward, Kenya has written to the AU. The AU has responded, telling the two countries to work it out amicably. What is the solution to making sure that there is peace and stability in this region, which, like you have said, the tension that we're seeing affects not just Kenya and Somalia, but also other neighboring countries like Ethiopia?
I think the first thing from where I stand, and I think this is a general consensus, is that Somalia has to, Farmajo in particular, has to ensure and engage with this local regional government and address the core issue about his political affiliation and his political ambitions, so to speak. And that is more of an internal issue that he has to deal with. But to try and link or try to seek sympathy by then perhaps portraying Kenya and indeed Ethiopia for that matter, or Djibouti or Eritrea as interfering in his country's internal affairs, I think he is engaging in what perhaps we would call seeking sympathy and trying to externalize the internal issues within Somalia themselves, and that he has not been, that is quite clear, he has not been effective in holding Somalia together. And as perhaps from the Kenyan perspective, Kenya has decided to, in many ways, for the time being, to keep as much distance as possible from what is happening within Somalia itself, that is in Mogadishu, because Farmajo is looking for a scapegoat and is trying to, perhaps say his political woes and political problems are not internal, rather external, which is not the case. Certainly, Kenya and Ethiopia and the other countries in the region, of course, will be very keen to see what developments are happening within Somalia. But they are also quite aware that it is in their interest that we have a stable Somalia. Remember, we still have the African Union UN in Somalia supposed to be getting out. Then we have the Al-Shabaab issue. And all the countries in the region, especially Kenya, and to a large extent Djibouti, and even Ethiopia, they would be very keen to have that the terror component, the Al-Shabaab link and hold within Somalia is dealt with and contained. It is in Kenya's best interest to do that.
All right. Let me bring in Dr. Maluki. All we're discussing has an impact in one way or the other on Kenyans who are living quite close to that border. Let's come back to the country. And like we are saying, the government is yet to say anything on this. We understand they will be issuing statements in the coming few days. But we have seen people, civilian casualties, in the shooting that happened in Bulahaya. Civilian casualties from both the Somali side and the Kenyan side, because it's pretty much the same town. Should the Kenyan government do more to try to stamp its authority on this, or should it, try to be as diplomatic as possible, even though Kenyan lives are being threatened close to the border?
Yes, thank you for that question. Before I get to that question, I think there's something that I want to clarify with regard to the Somali electoral process, because it is the cause of all these kind of misunderstanding. One of the challenges that Somalia as a state will have to deal with, yes, so that there can be regional peace, is that the President Farmajo had to accept the autonomy of the regions as provided in the Somali constitution. I think this is where the bone of the contention is. So there is a certain measure of autonomy which regional governments are supposed to exercise, and that includes how they relate with the central government and how they relate with other external actors. So that recognition is an important part of the current government in Somalia. But coming back to your question, yes, we all know that life is sacrosanct, and of course, every country exists to protect the lives of its citizens, Kenya not being excluded. And so it is very important that Kenya puts in place measures, actually security measures, to protect its citizens from any threat that may emanate, whether from Somalia or from anywhere else. So what I foresee here, we are not going to end the skirmishes in the border towns of Kenya and Somalia just by putting in place armed forces against each other. It needs a diplomatic intervention where the two countries will have to come to an understanding, and where the Somali government has to really resolve its internal frictions, so that the regions and the federal government are able to speak in one tone, and if it is national election, they are held peacefully. So whichever way Kenya approaches this situation, it has an obligation to protect lives, but it may not achieve much without the stability in Somalia. And that's why it needs a broader approach, so that if elections are going to be held in Somalia, let them be held peacefully, and let the international community ensure that whatever the results that will come, they will be accepted, because there is even more danger if the elections are refuted by some of the actors, and therefore that can even instigate more violence. And whenever there is violence in Somalia, it will of course spill over to Kenya, because we are neighboring countries. So it is not something that you can just approach using the military or armed forces, but it needs approach, including diplomatic approach, where international actors are involved. In fact, it's unfortunate that the U.S. During the Trump administration actually decided to withdraw the U.S. forces that have been in Somalia. Whether they have gone or not, there's that plan, and that of course puts Somalia at a bigger risk, because the U.S. forces in Somalia had a stabilizing force. So there is something that probably requires both the United Nations, AU, and other global bodies which are responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security.
John Gashie, let me bring you to what Dr. said there, going back to the politics of Somalia. Now, Somalia was a failed state for many years, since the collapse of Mohamed Siad Barre's government 30 years ago. and it took a lot of work from not just Somalia itself, but its neighbors also to get it to have stability. Would you say that Mohamed Farmajo has done enough to safeguard that peace and stability?
I would perhaps, if we were to perhaps rate him from, perhaps to simplify this, 1 out of 10, I would, Farmajo is to perhaps around 3. Now, what does that mean in terms of then the security of Kenya in itself? Remember, as of now, Kenya is home to one of the largest refugee population in the world, and nearly more than 3/4 of those refugees within Dadaab and other areas are from Somalia. They are fleeing from Somalia. But we also got to appreciate that for Kenya, I think it's in a situation what we'd call a catch-22 situation. Where, move too strongly, then you'll be accused of interfering. Not moving again too strongly, then it has an impact in Kenya. So for Kenya is a very delicate situation, what is happening in Somalia. Whichever way, Kenya is being used by Farmajo as I said, as scapegoat to try and then have what we call an external bogeyman, so to speak, and Kenya fits in within that Farmajo succession. But can Kenya afford not to be interested or engaged in Somalia? No, it cannot be. Kenya cannot sit on the sideline. Kenya must be constructively engaged with Somalia. Prior to Farmajo, post-Farmajo, or with Farmajo, Kenya has to engage. The question is, in what form or in what processes will Kenya then engage with Somalia? Over the last years, Kenya has tried to, engage Somalia from what you would call a positive engagement, spectrum, where Kenya is saying we are willing to be with you towards returning Somalia or stabilizing Somalia. But then we have the terror component. We have the Al-Shabaab, we have the trade, we have the historical, cultural, linguistic, and even geographic engagement with Somalia. So Kenya will always want to engage with Somalia, with whatever government that is in Somalia, but with only one thing in mind, that its security, its territorial boundaries, and trade within Kenya and Somalia are protected and enhanced. Now, what we have now is a government in Somalia, in Mogadishu, so to speak, that seeks to externalize its internal problems and is seeking to draw Kenya as a partisan player, which is not necessarily true. And perhaps Kenya has withheld, so to speak, provocation from Somalia, trying to, weather the storm, so to speak. But what is happening now in Mandera right now is an escalation. How does Kenya then handle this? One, Kenya must protect its territory. That's no question about that. But then Kenya must also not be drawn or edged on by a weaker government in Mogadishu or a weaker political system in Mogadishu that is almost certainly facing very stiff opposition, not only within Mogadishu, but from the east, from the north, and from the west. So those are that Kenya has to deal with.
All right. Daktari, let's stay with that. The infighting, political infighting seemingly between President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo and the regional leaders. ahead of those presidential and parliamentary elections next month. Who should be coming in to try and mediate in this? Should the African Union do more?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, quite a number of institutions have been established, of course, starting with IGAD. Both Kenya and Somalia are members of IGAD. There is African Union, of course, there's even the United Nations. All these are forums which could mediate, but they're also bilateral, avenues that are available for regional peace and stability. In my opinion, I think we have always tried to bring disputes first to the local organization, and therefore the Kenya-Somali conflict is purely under IGAD. And so before it even goes to AU, IGAD should be exhausted. The IGAD avenue should be exhausted. And I'm happy IGAD has been seized to this conflict for some time, and it should be supported so that we have that brotherly relations where Kenya and Somalia are able to talk to each other and agree on a number of issues. But that notwithstanding, there's a very important reality that the government of Farmajo must realize. In the Horn of Africa, we have two regional powers, Ethiopia and Kenya. And there's no way Somalia government is going to actually be stable without embracing both Ethiopia and Kenya. It is in the interest of Farmajo to actually embrace Kenya. Of course, it has been said for many quarters that Farmajo uses Kenyan case for political mileage, but I think that strategy is not working well. In my opinion, it is better if Kenya and Somalia were in better terms. That would even work better for Farmajo, just the way he has been dealing with Ethiopia. So recognition and realization of who is who in the region is very important. So I think one of the strategies that Farmajo may have to drop is the enmity that he seems to be creating, which is not necessary. Kenyans and Somalis have a very long history of coexistence, and they will live even beyond the current governments. And so that realization is very important. So whoever is in Somalia needs to realize that Kenya is not going anywhere, and cordial relations between the two countries will work better for any leader in Somalia. So the peace negotiation can be undertaken at different levels, starting with the IGAD, then African Union. And I think the African Union has already spelled itself out, and this is possible, and the conflict can be resolved. Yes.
How important is it for Somalia to have a very orderly and peaceful election next month for stability in the region?
It's very, very important because just as it was said earlier, without a peaceful election, Somalia is going to generate a lot of refugees. It's going to affect the regional trade, right, and livelihoods, and that is not good. We are already talking about the Sustainable Millennium Goals, and these are goals which every humanity needs to achieve. And therefore, peaceful elections in Somalia are very important, not just for the country, but also for the region. And my appeal is that all international actors must focus and take due diligence, actually take interest in how the elections are going to be conducted. Let it not be left to the Somali government alone. So we have the US, the government of Turkey, we have the government of the UK, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Ethiopia, Kenya. All these countries are stakeholders in the kind of stability that will ensue from a peaceful, successful election in Somalia. So there should be concerted effort by all actors to actually ensure the election succeeds.
Thank you, Dr. Ari. Let's get a final comment from John Gashie. John, what options does Nairobi have in dealing with this in the most delicately careful manner that it can in ensuring that its territorial integrity is protected, and as well as not appearing to be strong-armed in terms of dealing with Somalia?
I would say this, Ben, that perhaps, for lack of a better term, and I'm sure the Kenyan government is perhaps wishing and looking forward to a more, a more positive engagement with the government in Mogadishu, and that Kenya would rather not be used as a scapegoat, and also perhaps Kenya should not be provoked. So the position, perhaps from where I'm sitting, is that Kenya has played very, very delicate role of not appearing provoked. And Kenya has so far managed not to appear to be provoked publicly. But Kenya is also, I would like to imagine, as my colleague, Dr. is saying, Kenya cannot afford not to protect its citizens. Having said that, the question is what and then what means will be applied. And Kenya has refused to be kind of drawn out. If you remember, the government of Somalia broke relations with Kenya, and Kenya has not publicly, or retaliated, so to speak. Again, if you notice today, Kenya has written to the African Union. Kenya has also been engaged with IGAD. So Kenya is trying to kind of play what you would say is a non-confrontational engagement with Somalia, because it doesn't want to be pegged or pegged as an active player. Having said that, Kenya is following what is happening internally in Somalia very, very, very closely. And indeed, that ought to be the case. But without perhaps, being drawn out, because there are lots of issues between Kenya and Somalia. One of the largest diaspora of Somalis and Somali citizens is in Kenya. We still have the issue of the border and the issue of the sea. We still have to meet within the international court to determine how the boundaries will be sorted out. But we have the Al-Shabaab issue, and then we have Jubaland issue. So all those issues are quite complicated. And Kenya is trying not to be seen as the aggressive party.
Thank you, John Gashie, for that. Just stay on the line. Thank you for your comments on Somalia. We shall continue to keep an eye on what's happening at the Horn of Africa. I want you, gentlemen, to stay on the line for your comment on news just in we're getting from Nigeria, West Africa, saying that the country's president, Muhammadu Buhari, has fired the heads of the country's armed forces, whom he appointed when he first took office back in 2015. In a surprise move, he also tweeted the names of their replacements. No reason was given for the resignations of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and the Chief of Defense Staff heads. It comes as Nigeria continues to grapple with widespread insecurity, including the long-running Boko Haram insurgency and rampant kidnappings. There have been calls, notably from the country's powerful governors, the National Assembly, for the president to replace the service chiefs, as many felt they were underperforming. Buhari, a former army general, was elected in 2015 on the promise of ending the insurgency in Nigeria's northeastern region. However, Boko Haram continues to stage attacks despite the government saying on several occasions that Islamist militants have been defeated. Breaking news there, news just in from West Africa there, Muhammadu Buhari changing the military formation for the first time since he became Commander-in-Chief back in 2015. I want your quick comment on it, John Gashie. Let me begin with you. Just 30 seconds only.
Yeah, I would say perhaps for Muhammad Buhari, if you remember, as you rightly pointed out, in 1983, he took over power. And at that particular time, he was a military ruler, and he was a no-nonsense president. Now, in this time he's been now a president, the Boko Haram issue has run without any clear-cut, shall I say, results, so to speak. And I think it's about time then Muhammad Buhari was to put his foot down, because his reputation, his agenda would be perhaps questioned in very near course and in very near future, even he cannot contain that. Has the Nigerian military managed to contain this? No, certainly not. Has the leadership been there? Certainly not. Can the Nigerian army contain that? It ought to have done that long time ago.
All right. Thank you. Daktari, what is your take on Buhari's first change of guard since he became Commander-in-Chief?
I think the institutional re-engineering is very important in Nigeria, because Nigerian security has been one of the most troubled. And we have had very worrying situations of abductions, maiming, killing by Boko Haram and other groups. And so I think what the president is doing is really in order, because he is in charge and he has to prove that he's in charge. If the security of the country is really to be tightened, I think it is necessary for re-engineering of institutions and organs of government to ensure that there is adequate security in the country.
All right, thank you, Daktari. Dr. Patrick Maluki, chairman of the Diplomatic Scholars Association of Kenya, and regional security expert John Gashie joining us on the phone. Many thanks, gentlemen, for being with us and for sharing your opinions on what's happening at the Horn of Africa. We shall continue to keep an eye on that as we wait to hear what the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has to say, what the government has to say, has been dealing with this ever so delicately. Thank you for staying with us. That's why we leave it on KTN Prime this Tuesday night, the 26th day of January 2021. Before we leave you, let's not bring you